They ate people. The Algonquin tribes of Canada lived in constant fear of a monster, a bloodthirsty cannibal known to them as the Wendigo. It was the embodiment of starvation, a demon that could possess a man at any moment, turning him into a hideous creature with a taste for human flesh. The Wendigo was indomitable, an abomination against all that was natural, and in the minds of the Algonquin people, it posed a very real threat, which is why they relied on their Ogama to protect them. The Ogama acted as a sort of spiritual leader, one who could harness mystical powers to protect his clan from illness and evil spirits. Jack Fiddler was one such Ogama who lived in the early 1900s, and he and his family were notorious for one thing: killing Wendigos, or more accurately, killing people they thought were Wendigos. But things were about to change. The Canadian government were expanding closer and closer into Cree territory, and soon the Canadian common law and Native American spiritualism would clash, and the results would be nothing short of tragic. So I want you to come along with me over 100 years ago to the wintry forests of Ontario to meet Jack Fiddler and his family, and witness a court case that would change the future of Canada forever. This is Legend Has It. I'm your host, Michael Walker, and the legends about the Wendigo killers just might be true. Now, I want to give you a quick explanation of what a Wendigo is before we get started. There's a lot of contradicting information and misconceptions about Wendigos, and a lot of that is because the Algonquin cultures that believed in the Wendigo mostly relied on oral storytelling to pass their history and their legends from one generation to the next. Stories would be retold over and over with details either forgotten or added along the way, until the very notion of what defined a Wendigo varied from tribe to tribe, clan to clan, and even person to person, similar to how stories and definitions of vampires and witches vary from culture to culture. A common description in modern folklore is that the Wendigo is an unstoppable hunter, a giant, shaggy-haired beast with the skeletal head of a deer, and that it can mimic voices to lure unsuspecting campers to their doom. This is a modern interpretation that mostly originated on the internet, and it is a drastic departure from the original accounts of the Wendigo. In traditional mythology, a Wendigo isn't exactly a monster so much as it is a spirit, one which possesses a person and then proceeds to transform them into a ghoulish creature. Some stories say they look like an emaciated human, one with gaunt features and skin white as snow, or their hair would grow extremely long and turn white. Some Wendigos grew to be 12-foot tall giants that would stomp through the forest searching for hunters, and some just looked like an average person, a horror walking unnoticed among the other villagers. But the key feature in every version of the Wendigo legend is the hunger. See, Wendigos are cursed with an unsatisfiable craving for human flesh. In some versions of the legend, a person is turned into a Wendigo after resorting to cannibalism to survive a harsh winter, while in other versions it's actually the Wendigo spirit that drives them to eat another person. It was dishonorable to die as a Wendigo. People feared these monsters, yes, but they feared becoming one even more, which is why they relied so heavily on the Ogama to protect them and drive out the evil Wendigo spirit from their villages. This was especially true for the Sucker Clan, a group of Cree Native Americans who occupied an area that is now recognized as Ontario. See, throughout the 19th century, the Hudson's Bay Company heavily encouraged fur trapping throughout northern Canada, and for the first few decades the fur trade was very lucrative. But as the years went on, several fur-bearing animals like beaver and rabbit became harder and harder to find. The Native Americans who lived there not only didn't have enough game to trade, They didn't have enough to survive. One man described the Cree people as being, quote, in a most wretched state and almost starved, being destitute of ammunition, nearly naked, and scarcely possessed of a necessary article to enable them to procure a living. They were starving, and with that starvation came stories of the Wendigo. The members of the Sucker clan were desperate for someone, anyone who could protect them, and luckily their prayers would be answered when one day a stranger appeared in their village. And let me make something abundantly clear. When I say that this man appeared in the Sucker village, I mean that quite literally. This wasn't some random person from another clan who had just stumbled into their territory. No, I mean that one day, a fully grown, adult man appeared out of thin air on the roof of a longhouse. He wasn't a member of the Sucker clan. In fact, none of the villagers recognized him as belonging to any of the surrounding clans either. He was a complete stranger. Confused, the villagers asked this man what his name was and what he was doing in their encampment. He proudly lifted his head up high and proclaimed to them, "They call me the porcupine standing sideways. I lived before in this world. Now I am here again." The Suckers allowed the man to live among them, and he would prove his worth to the people. Porcupine was a natural-born shaman. According to legends about him, he was able to use magic spells to heal sick members of the clan and summon animals when food was scarce. It was these innate abilities that led to Porcupine becoming their Ogama, and soon he would come face to face with the dreaded Wendigo. There was a Native American man from another clan who lived amongst the Sucker people. I don't know what the man's name was, but legend says that his people came from Lac Seul, or the Lake of the White Pine Narrows, and were always at odds with the Sucker clan. One day, Porcupine saw the man unloading his canoe. He had been on a hunting trip with his wife and children and was gone for several days. Curious to see if he had caught anything, Porcupine approached the man, but to his horror he realized that the man wasn't unloading an animal. No, he was holding one of his children in his arms. The child was dead, having passed away during the trip. The man quickly became irate, yelling at Porcupine and chastising him for his meddling before storming off. A few weeks later, Porcupine took one of his daughters with him to check a fish trap that he had set up when she fell and drowned in the freezing lake. It was a horrible freak accident, but Porcupine believed it was no accident. According to Porcupine, the man from Lac Seul had put a curse on his daughter that caused her to drown in the lake that day. The next autumn, the Sucker people suffered a terrible famine, one that they of course blamed on the people from Lac Seul. But this time, Porcupine had a solution. He ordered that the entire clan come together and thoroughly clean a wood lodge. At the end of the day, when they were done, he gathered everyone and they all sat in a circle on the floor. He fashioned a fake moose leg out of wood and passed it around the circle, and when each person held the moose leg, they said out loud what part of the moose they most wanted to eat. And once everyone had done so, they disbanded for the night. Porcupine standing sideways sent a hunter out into the forest the next day, and sure enough he came back with a large moose. The Sucker people ate their fill and went on to survive the winter. It seemed that the curse had been broken. Sometime in the winter of the next year, all of the village elders, including Porcupine, fell ill. As night drew near, the other villagers saw a strange red flame far off into the forest. They heard loud, booming footsteps that shook the ground. The Wendigo was coming for them. While the other villagers hid in their homes, Porcupine summoned what little strength he had left and walked outside, taking an axe and a whip with him into the forest. They say that an unnatural storm brewed while Porcupine was gone. Huge gray clouds rolled in and the wind blew so hard that it actually bent the giant pine trees. But above the howling wind, the villagers could still hear the cracking of Porcupine's whip. After what seemed like forever, the whipping stopped. The villagers waited with bated breath, wondering if the Wendigo had killed their Ogama. But no, the door to the wood lodge swung open and Porcupine stepped inside, and he dumped the monster on the floor. He had killed it. Those that were there gathered around, gawking at the horrible creature at their feet. It was ghastly, with long white hair that stood straight up, and a patch of white fur running down its back. But the most frightening detail was that the villagers all recognized his face. It was the man from the White Pine Narrows. Porcupine had several wives and 5 children over the course of his life. I couldn't find the names of his 2 daughters, but we know that he had 3 sons: Peter Flett, Joseph Fiddler, and the oldest son, Jack Fiddler. I'm not going to lie to you, I find pronouncing Jack's full given birth name very difficult, and I don't want to butcher it, so I'm just going to include it in the episode description if you want to take a look at that. However, I can tell you that his name translates to "he who stands in the southern sky" in the OG Cree language. Jack lived during a time of expansion when the white men from the south were steadily encroaching on Cree territory, and as a result, many Cree people took Christian names, so he dubbed himself Jack Fiddler. Jack trained for many years under his father Porcupine, learning the ways of mystical healing and how to protect his people from curses in order to become the next Ogama. According to the stories told about him, Jack Fiddler was able to interpret his dreams and learn how to cure people's illnesses. He was a great leader in Shamen, and he had the love and respect of everyone in the Sucker clan, and in 1891 they would all come together to grieve with him. Porcupine Standing Sideways, their beloved Ogama, passed away from old age in the fall of that year. The Sucker clan gave Porcupine a proper burial, and they prayed to Manitou, the Great Spirit, to guide his soul to the afterlife. This grieving period was short-lived, however. Winter was on its way, and the Sucker clan needed an Ogama to keep them safe, so Jack Fiddler, who was around 60 years old at this point, was appointed as the new shaman. And boy did he not waste any time. They say that Jack Fiddler killed 14 Wendigos during his life, and he had subdued even more than that. The same year that Porcupine Standing Sideways passed away, one of Porcupine's wives had some sort of mental breakdown and tried to kill herself, but Jack was able to stop her. While he had her restrained, he sent his sons out to an HBC trading post to buy 16 ounces of scotch that they would use in a burnt offering to drive the Wendigo spirit out of her body. A few years after that, there was a man who lived in the Sucker village named Watup, who the other villagers believed was on the verge of becoming a Wendigo. The way the story goes, his insides were frozen, and they could hear the ice inside him crunch and grind when he moved. Upon hearing this news, Jack Fiddler ran to the man's tent right away. He grabbed 2 cans that he started to bang together, and he danced around Watup's tent, screaming some incantation at the top of his lungs before barging in. Jack grabbed the man and threw him to the ground with the intent of beating the spirit out of him. The man opened his mouth and yelled at Jack to stop, but no sound came out. Only a wisp of cold air escaped his lips. Watup tried to get back up, but Jack tossed him out of the tent and began to beat the man mercilessly with a whip until he felt that the Wendigo spirit had left Watup's body. During these years, things were only getting worse for the Sucker clan. A majority of the Native American population in Canada were still starving. In 1900, the Manitoba Free Press actually published an article titled "Indians Starve to Death. Members of the Saulteaux tribe in northern Keewatin perished last winter owing to failure of game." And yes, this famine did end up causing some people to resort to cannibalism in order to survive. Take for example the case of Kichi Kakapatikwe and her family, who after many weeks were finally found stranded in the frozen forests around Narrows Lake. A man passing through the area on his way to the trading post found Kichi clutching her baby, her face gaunt and her body skeletal, but she and the baby were still alive. Kichi explained that her husband, Ketchup, had passed away during the winter due to the flu, and Kichi had wrapped his body in a blanket that she kept near her camp so that he could be buried properly. Weeks later, when it was safe to travel back to Narrows Lake, a group of men were sent to retrieve Ketchup's body, but they noticed something odd. There was a large section of Ketchup's hip that had been cut off with a knife. When the men returned home and questioned Kichi about this, she dropped her head in guilt and confirmed their suspicions. She had eaten her husband. William Campbell didn't know it yet, but he was about to ruin Jack Fiddler's life. William was a well-seasoned trader at one of the HBC trading posts that members of the Sucker Clan frequented. He had been working there for several years and was familiar with the culture and traditions of the Native American people in the area, including how they handled cases of Wendigos. One day, a man who traded regularly at Campbell's post was shot to death after being accused of being a Wendigo. Campbell tried to report the murder, but the officials he reported to just weren't interested in intervening in the affairs of the indigenous people, and Campbell was taught to just leave them alone. That's just the way things were in the Sandy Lakes region. There was no reason for him to get involved. As far as Campbell was concerned, the Cree and all of the issues plaguing their communities existed worlds away from his own. But that didn't mean they weren't also a curiosity, and he would sometimes share stories about the Cree with other traders who visited his post, and that's how Sergeant Daisy Smith came to learn about the Wendigo killings. One such story was how a group of Cree men had killed a woman at an encampment near Campbell's post. But unlike Campbell, Smith was horrified by these stories, and he decided to do something about it. See, Smith was part of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and he sent a letter to his superiors immediately detailing the crimes he felt were being committed. A reply came in late December of 1906, telling Smith to begin an investigation. On March 16, 1907, Constable J.A.W. O'Neill stopped at a trading post near Island Lake, where he was joined on April 15th by Constable Cashman, and the two immediately set out on their journey. It wasn't long before they came across Jack Fiddler's sons, Robert and Adam Fiddler. At this time, Jack Fiddler was in his 70s. He was growing old and very weak, and he wouldn't be able to continue acting as shaman for the Sucker Clan much longer. The Fiddler brothers told the two constables they were going to have a council soon where Jack would pass on the role of Ogama to Robert. Cashman and O'Neill said that they wanted to hold a council of their own with both the Sucker and Crane clans at a nearby trade post that summer. The Fiddlers believed that they probably wanted to discuss a treaty and agree to the meeting. The previous winter, like most, had been hard on the Sucker clan. They needed all the help they could get. The council was held on June 1st, and the Crane family all gathered at the trading post to participate, but the members of the Sucker clan arrived late the day after. In their absence, the constables had the opportunity to talk to the Crane clan and have a lengthy discussion about the Cree's customs and traditions, as well as Canadian common law, which ended with the constables asking if there had been any recent murders in the area. A man named Norman Ray stood and spoke. He told them the same story that William Campbell relayed to Sergeant Smith. In the fall of 1906, Norman stopped to spend the night at a camp near Campbell's trading post when Joseph Fiddler and his son, Thomas, came up to the camp in a canoe. They had a woman named Wasakapique with them. She was delirious, slobbering and mumbling incoherently and twisting her body in a terrible fit, which is why they had to restrain her. Jack Fiddler arrived the next night, and the men deliberated on what could be done to help the woman, but unfortunately Jack surmised that they were too late. At this point in the procession, their only option was to kill Wasakapique. Wasakapique was sleeping while the men spoke, so she had no idea what was happening when Norman fell on top of her, holding her down while Jack and Joseph wrapped a cord around her neck and pulled. There was a small fight, but soon Norman felt Wasakapique go limp in his arms. The men buried her in the nearby forest. Norman readily admitted his and the other men's involvement in the murder because, in his eyes, they had done nothing wrong. They had protected their families from a terrible monster. They hadn't murdered a woman in cold blood. No, they had killed a Wendigo. But Norman's confession only fueled the constable's convictions, and now they knew exactly who they were going after. Neither Jack nor Joseph Fiddler were with the crew of sucker men that came to visit the constables on June 2nd. They were both at a camp on Windy Lake, so the constables left immediately to go arrest them. Once they reached the sucker camp, O'Neill and Cashman were swarmed with hospitality. They found that the sucker people were actually very kind and approachable. But then again, the sucker people didn't know they were there to arrest their Ogama. It didn't take long for O'Neill and Cashman to find the Fiddler brothers, and they sat them down to inform them of the crimes they had committed. Naturally, Jack and Joseph were surprised by these accusations, but they ultimately agreed to go peacefully. The constables took Jack and Joseph, as well as Norman Ray and Jack's son-in-law Angus Ray, back to a place called Norway House for a preliminary hearing, where Jack and Joseph would be charged with murder. The news spread like wildfire. People all over Canada weighed in on the issue, some saying that the Fiddler brothers should suffer the death penalty, while others argued that they should go free, since they were part of a different society that didn't have the same laws as they did, and the men didn't know any better. Jack and Joseph were held for 2 months while they waited for a trial, during which Superintendent C.E. Saunders pled for the prosecution to be dropped and the men let go. Saunders didn't see a point in keeping the men there for disobeying laws that they didn't know existed, and he didn't even think they had enough physical evidence to convict the brothers with. The conditions they were kept in were awful, and Jack Fiddler's health only continued to get worse. One day, he decided he couldn't take the weight of it all anymore. While they were held in captivity, the Fiddlers, Norman, and Angus were allowed out to a small yard next to the forest so that they could prepare their meals each day. They were overseen by a man named Warren, who watched them as they prepared their food. He was mostly focused on the younger men, Norman, Angus, and Joseph, who worked on making a fire to cook over, and while he was distracted, Jack used the opportunity to disappear into the forest. They found Jack several hours later, a slipknot made from his sash tied around a tree limb and slipped around his neck. He wasn't moving. Jack Fiddler, the infamous Wendigo killer, had strangled himself to death. The fight wasn't over for his brother Joseph Fiddler, however. His trial began on the morning of October 7th, 1907. The very first item addressed was whether or not there had been any non-Indigenous people around that could have taught the sucker people Canadian law. There hadn't been. In fact, many of them had never even seen a white person before. The nearest non-native person available would have been William Campbell, but his trading post was nearly 100 miles away from the Sandy Lakes region that the Sucker clan occupied. Joseph would have had absolutely no exposure to the laws he was being prosecuted over. Nevertheless, the trial continued, and Norman and Angus both took the stand. They told the jury the story of Wasikapequa's murder, as well as some others. Apparently, a few years after Porcupine's death, Jack and Joseph Fiddler had killed their brother, Peter Flett, because he too showed symptoms of being a Wendigo. The evidence against him was growing minute by minute. There was no possible way Joseph was getting out of this unscathed. There was a short deliberation on whether or not Joseph should be held accountable for laws he didn't know existed, but then the jurors left to make their decision. When they gathered back in the courtroom that afternoon, they had their verdict, and it was an interesting one at that. They found Joseph Fiddler guilty. That part isn't exactly shocking, considering, yes, he did actually kill several people, but they did ask that the judge be lenient with his punishment, quote, on account of the prisoner's ignorance and superstition. In response, Joseph Fiddler stood up, and with the help of a translator addressed everyone there in the court. I did not know any better. I am angry, he said. I was in hopes I would be let off without being punished. I do not want my life to be taken away until my death comes. I wish that God had blessed me. I have no wish to say any more. Unfortunately, Joseph's words and the jurors' convictions fell on deaf ears. Joseph was sentenced to hang from the neck until dead. Back at Sandy Lake, the Sucker clan was devastated. They had lost two of their greatest leaders, and even without the threat of curses and wendigos, they didn't have enough resources to help them survive. It was a familiar situation, one they had managed to survive for decades, but Robert Fiddler sought to put an end to it. In 1910, he added his clan to the group of indigenous people listed in Treaty 5, which would give them government assistance and resources in exchange for land and promising to practice the government's laws. Or at least, it was supposed to. According to a First Nations newspaper, Wawate News, the provisions that came as a result of Treaty 5 have been less than favorable. Apparently, the Sucker clan were promised land on a reserve, one that they weren't actually able to move into until 1945 because the Canadian government, quote, was reluctant to survey the land that was promised for fear of accidentally giving the First Nations people land that was considered valuable, that had monetary value, that had mineral potential. The Wendigo hunters would no longer have a place in Canada, and several more people would be arrested and charged for the murder of people that they had considered Wendigos. Oh, and one last note about Joseph Fiddler. See, he actually managed to get his sentence changed from death to life in prison, but shortly after that he took ill with pneumonia and was admitted to Stony Mountain Hospital. His condition was terrible. Everyone knew that Joseph was on death's doorstep, and they were very sympathetic to the poor man. Several petitions were signed by people who were at the trial asking to have Joseph released so that he could see his family one last time before he died, and they actually worked. On September 4th, 1909, Stony Mountain Hospital received a letter from the Governor General telling them that Joseph was a free man. Unfortunately, the letter was too late. Joseph Fiddler had passed away only 3 days prior. The Legend Has It podcast is researched, written, and produced by me, Michael Walker, with recording and editing assistance from Nicole Tomplet. All of the music in this episode comes courtesy of freesound.com, and all links will be listed in the episode description along with the sources cited. I would like to take a moment to thank all of you who listened to our first episode last month on the Boggy Creek Monster, and I'd like to send a big shout out to my buddy Tristan, who became a monthly $1 donor over on Anchor Podcasts. At the moment, you can really only find us on both Anchor and on YouTube. I'm kind of in the middle of figuring out how to distribute to other podcasting networks, but it's taking longer than expected due to some technical difficulties. But I'll let you guys know when we get that all figured out. I probably should have plugged this in the first episode, but a good way to keep up with the show is on Instagram at Legend Has It Podcasts. You'll get updates, hear when new episodes come out, and maybe, get to see some artwork courtesy of yours truly. And as always, I ask that you follow us there. Please like, subscribe, leave some comments or reviews, all that fun stuff. We're only 2 episodes into the podcast, and, little things like that really help us out. For our next episode, we'll be going someplace a little warmer than the forests of northern Canada, the Florida Keys, where we'll get to meet one of Key West's most famous residents, Robert, the Haunted Doll. It's gonna be a good one, so stay tuned, and thanks for listening.